All right, welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. In spite of the US and UK's condemnation of the Syrian elections, President Bashar al Assad won another office term with 95.1% of the votes on May 27th, 2021. 14 million of the 18 million eligible voters in and out of Syria voted, which is a 78.64% turnout rate. The mainstream Western corporate media are claiming that the elections were not fair and that Bashar al-Assad is a dictator despite there being no evidence of fraud that they presented. So here to discuss these elections and to debunk mainstream media claims about them is award-winning journalist Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, it's an honor to have you back on the show. How are you?
Hi, Franco. Thanks so much for getting me back on.
Yeah. Thank you for coming back on. It's an honor to have you. So Vanessa, supposedly Syria is an authoritarian dictatorship, according to U.S. and UK mainstream media outlets. Well, then why were people out there celebrating, like in these clips that I'm about to show people here? Here's a clip by Eva Bartlett. It said last night in Umayyad Square, Damascus, before and after the presidential election results were announced, a most beautiful night. Syrians celebrating their sovereignty, and then we see Syrians out there in the street celebrating. There's people out of
Yeah.
their cars, and then you also had a post that you put up of what you saw on the ground. You said urban Eastern Ghouta on election day, free from Western sponsored terrorism. The Syrian people show the world what they think of FUKUS genetically modified pseudo democracy. And then here we have a post from Marwa Osman showing a million march in Tartus yesterday night celebrating Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. So what did you want to tell us a little bit more about what you saw on the ground during the election?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, the dogs might start barking at any minute because
It's
there's
all right.
people coming around and kids playing outside. So I apologize for any interruptions.
No problem.
Um, Look, I was here. Obviously, I'm living in Damascus. I've been here almost 2 years now. And even prior to that, I'd spent, big chunks of time here in Syria, particularly during many of the liberation campaigns by the Syrian Arab Army and allies and so on. And to be honest, the response to the elections was even a surprise for me
Hmm.
because I'd seen firsthand to what degree the Syrian people are suffering under 10 years of war, 10 years of propaganda and information war, 10 years of incremental sanctions ending up in the Caesar sanctions under Trump, which has effectively caused, inflation, price hikes, fuel shortages. Of course, all of those can't be seen in isolation. We can talk about that in a bit, but they have to be seen in conjunction with the war that is being waged on all levels. It's a hybrid war. It's a multi-spectrum war that is being waged against this country. And I had seen how exhausted people were, and how jaded they were by what was effectively a manufactured post-war depression, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Syrian people, the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and its allies had won the military war. They defended their country against one of the most heavily funded and most orchestrated. The British and American investment in this war was incredible. We're talking billions,
Mm-hmm.
and yet militarily it failed. And so then the sanctions were brought in as, if you like, to beat the people into
Mm-hmm.
submission and to turn them against the government pre-election. And of course, at the same time, we saw an uptick in let's say, international legal cases against President Assad, against members of his family, et cetera, trying to further demonize, further criminalize the leadership of this country, right? So it was a very heavyweight campaign prior to the elections, because of course the last thing the US alliance wants is for there to be an election victory for the president that they've basically been trying to topple for more than 10 years. right? Because of course the plans for this war came into conception way before 2011. It all depended on Assad's response to American demands. And so when the election was approaching, I actually was very fortunate to be able to go to a number of the areas that had been liberated by the Syrian Arab Army from the armed group occupation, and to speak with people that had lived under that armed group occupation, and to see them sort of celebrating the elections in advance and showing their support for President Assad, which was extraordinary. And the fact that President Assad went and posted his vote in Duma, which of course was the scene of the alleged chemical attack that has been discredited by the inspectors who were members of the actual Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons team that went and actually did the on-the-ground investigation in Duma. So even prior to the election results, there were these messages being sent by the Syrian people to the West that effectively the West's opinion of them is irrelevant, right? That they will determine the future of their country. They will determine how they live their lives. They will not be dictated to by the US coalition into submitting to a backward-thinking medieval ideology Islamist regime, which is the preferred option for the US to be in place in Syria to give them control over the region. And then when election day actually came, I mean, really, it was extraordinary. People from every single corner of this country that is under the protection of the Syrian state. So that only, that includes everywhere except, of course, the Northwest and the Northeast. The Northeast is under US occupation. The Northwest is under Turkish, Al-Qaeda, US proxy occupation. So effectively, I mean, millions of people went out both to vote and the celebrations after when the results came in were just extraordinary. And for me, this isn't about even the election or the re-election of President Assad. This is about the Syrian people saying, we choose resistance over submission. Right. Whatever you do to us, whatever you throw at us, whatever you try to impose on us, we are not accepting it. And we are deciding our future. And, the joke is the West is talking all the time about wanting democracy in Syria. And yet in Germany and in Turkey, for example, they prevented Syrians going to their embassy to vote for their preferred candidate, right? And in Lebanon, US Contras basically attacked Syrians who were going to the embassy to vote, and actually one guy was killed. So this is the democracy that the West wants to impose upon Syria. When it's a democracy that doesn't give them the results they want, they don't like it, and they prevent it, and they prohibit it, or they criticize it, or they claim that the elections were rigged, that ballots were double cast, etc., etc. But as you say, where's the evidence?
Yeah. Where is the evidence? An important point that you brought up today on your Twitter is that the U.S. is becoming a police state, and I think we should address some of the State Department talking points that even some journalists who claim that they themselves are anti-imperialist, that they repeat these talking points, saying that Syria is a police state. You put out a thread today talking about this, so I'm just going to put this up for everybody. So you're in your thread, you talk about how, like, even some of these anti-imperialist journalists are repeating the State Department talking point, right? So what would you like people to know about this thread?
I think what is really important, as anti-imperialist journalists, it's not our place to impose in any way. I mean, I've heard comments that, the elections were not democratic. On what basis does someone make that judgment? On the basis that US elections are democratic? On the basis that UK elections are democratic or French elections are democratic? They're not. America is the biggest political theater in the world, right? I don't think you've had an election that hasn't had suspicion of being rigged or of being pre-organized or pre-orchestrated, right?
They're
So
privately
on what
owned.
basis
Yeah.
are people, are people making the judgment that this was an undemocratic election? It was run according to the Syrian constitution, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like in Yemen. You know, there is a constitutionally elected coalition government, but it's not recognized internationally because it's not democratic. What right do we, as Westerners, to, if you like, take this Orientalist stance, where even though we're saying we're anti-imperialist, we're criticizing a country for not following our norms? But it's not our place to do that, right? Not, and certainly not without context. I mean, if you're going to just come out with a bold statement, which is a CIA MI6 talking point about Syria, that it's a police state, you have to put in the context. You have to say that for 75 years, Syria has been the target of various coups d'etat, various assassination attempts, regime change operations, weaponization of the Muslim Brotherhood that has led to mass suicide attacks, attacks on civilians, massacres. Yesterday was the anniversary of the massacre of Syrian Arab Army cadets in Aleppo by Muslim Brotherhood, which was one of the most horrific massacres in Syria's history, you know? And so therefore you can't expect a country that has been 10 years at war, not only with the US coalition, but longer than that with Israel. It's had its territory annexed by both Turkey and Israel, and that is an ongoing operation, right? You can't expect it to operate under normal standards. You know? I mean, as Peter Ford, the former British ambassador to Syria, said to me, he said, well, you know, with everything that's going on and has been going on for decades against Syria, you cannot expect this country not to be policing foreign intervention, right? And you know, I mean, I put as part of the thread, which kind of because I'm actually at the moment researching for an article about this to really push back against this authoritarian state, police state, talking points that people kind of throw out, even anti-imperialist journalists, almost as to protect themselves against the, you know, the Assadist slur. Well, that's not journalism, that's brand protection.
Yeah.
If you're a journalist, you should be analyzing the situation and looking at the history of the situation and explaining that to people. Look, the British during World War II, as has recently been revealed, MI5 were running summary execution programs for people that were suspected spies, and they got it wrong, by the way. They executed people that were not actually spies, right? MI6 covered up their rendition and torture program, right? America was running black sites like Abu Ghraib. America is training the UAE to torture Yemenis in southern Yemen. So, you know, let's put this into context a little bit. Saudi Arabia is a de facto police state. Israel is a de facto police state. It's a de facto terrorist state, but it's supported by the US. Right? So if you're going to make the comment that Syria is an authoritarian state or it has a security apparatus, of course it has a security apparatus. It needs a security apparatus.
It has to protect itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, and look into the history of the political prisoners, because that's another one that, you know, gets repeated without actually anyone providing any evidence. Of course, people will say, yeah, but there's a case from CJER, there's a case from a number of legal entities. But again, those cases have largely been debunked and discredited by decent journalists who've dug deeper and looked into the actual and analyzed the facts. You know, I don't know if you remember in 2016, Amnesty put out the Sadnaya prison report, which actually eventually they had to retract because it was based entirely on kind of a virtual imagery. The facts were entirely wrong, as proven by Peter Ford again, who was British ambassador, who had visited Sadnaya prison, but even by a former prisoner who said, look, there's not that many prisoners in there. It's a small prison, and the majority of them are hardcore extremists armed group members, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you expect Syria to do? Its country has been invaded by hundreds of thousands of ideologically insane extremist groups funded and backed by the US coalition, right? America has black sites all over the world collecting Al-Qaeda operatives. Yet those same Al-Qaeda operatives are not able to be put in prison by the country that they're attacking, right? You know, this is the hypocrisy of not only the American government, the UK, the EU, all the coalition that has been waging this war against Syria. So I think the takeaway point for me is we as anti-imperialist journalists, we shouldn't fall into the Orientalist trap of still instructing a country, in a sense, passively as to what it should be doing. It's not our place to say that the elections are undemocratic. The Syrians made a choice. It's their choice.
Yeah, and those are great points too. Like if you want to be a journalist, you have to fearlessly call things for what it is. And it's just part of the job. Like if you claim to be an anti-imperialist, you have to prepare for some smears that you're going to get from the people who peddle the status quo and the State Department talking points, right? You're going to have to face that.
You know, staying on safe ground actually, and it's a strong way of putting it, it maintains the war.
Yeah.
Because while we allow those CIA talking points to keep running, we're effectively supporting the propaganda that has sustained the war against Syria for 10 years. And we have to remember that the nations that are targeted by the US and its alliance are the weaker party here. We as journalists should always be speaking truth to power. We should never be covering up truth on behalf of power. However minor those points may be, we have to be very strict on ourselves. And remember what our goal is. Our goal is to stop these imperialist wars. Our goal is to expose the people behind these wars and the agenda behind these wars. It's not to, if you like, further point the finger at the weaker nation in the middle of a war, in the middle of sanctions, in the middle of being devastated by the US coalition, that they're not democratic enough.
Right. I want to show people like some more of these pictures of how many people went out and celebrated. So here's another tweet that says President Bashar al-Assad has been declared the victor in the Syrian presidential elections. So here's the photos showing the massive crowd size. In addition to like what I showed you and Eva Bartlett showing like what was happening on the ground, there's so many people that went on the ground. But then according to some of the mainstream media talking points, wouldn't this be considered like a super spreader event? And is Syria like is the majority of the population vaccinated? Is there a rise in cases? Like according to what the mainstream media says.
No, I forgot about that. Yeah, no.
Yeah. So like.
No, I mean,
right.
You know, Syria has taken, considering the conditions that most, probably 80% of Syrians are living under, which is extreme poverty and immune system compromising conditions. There have been relatively low case rates here of whatever COVID is, of course. AstraZeneca vaccines were sent here by COVAX, but actually there's a bit of a pushback now by Syrian doctors, both inside and outside Syria, to actually put a stop on administering the AstraZeneca vaccine because of the various problems with it, the blood clotting, the death, the disastrous side effects in many cases, and the cover-up in the UK in particular of the adverse effects. Which has been reported largely by UK column. And, you know, very early on, the president made the decision that there would be no lockdown because he considered that the lockdown would be more damaging to the economy and to the people than the virus itself. So, you know, yeah, there have been school closures, there have been measures taken, masks are not mandatory. Except in very specific institutions, for example. Some people have received vaccines, but there's no, like, if you like, massive program going on here as there is in the West. Whether or not, I mean, that just strikes me as a kind of, a desperate attempt to kind of throw some kind of shit at the Syrian government, basically. Oh, look, they allowed all these millions of people to go on the streets, and now they've started another whole wave of COVID. I mean, I don't know. It just, I didn't even take any notice of it, to be honest.
So, also according to the Western mainstream media outlets, they claim that Sunnis hate Assad. However, here are posts by Kavark Almasian. We see Sunni Muslims happily voting for Assad. So let me show this post here. See, Sunni Muslims hate Assad, source mainstream media. And then he's showing like right here in Damascus, it said Rif Damascus, people coming out there and celebrating Banayas. And then let me see what else he showed. But yeah, so what's the history of like Sunnis and Assad? Was there a conflict before? And is this a myth that Sunnis are supposed to hate Assad?
Look, President Assad's wife is Sunni Muslim. The majority of parliamentarians, to my knowledge, are Sunni Muslim. The majority of the Syrian Arab Army are Sunni Muslim. The majority in Syria is Sunni Muslim. So could someone explain to me how so many people came out in the streets and voted for President Assad? Because the majority of those would have been Sunni Muslim. By the demographics of the country, they would be Sunni Muslim. The Sunni Muslims, and I would hesitate to call them that, the Muslim Brotherhood and the extremist factions inside Syria that have throughout history since 1946 been weaponized by the West against successive Syrian regimes or governments and military figures, are definitely against Assad because one, they're incentivized to be, and two, of course, Muslim Brotherhood is, if you like, the political arm of extremist Islam, and so therefore they see that it's an opportunity for a power grab inside Syria. So they're quite welcoming of the US coalition, the Israeli, the Turkish, the Saudi, and the Qatari backing for their cause, let's say. So that sector of Sunni Muslim society would be against the government, but it's against the government because it is weaponized to be against the government, and it's largely incentivized to be against the government. But the majority of, let's say, secular Sunni Muslims inside Syria support President Assad and support the Syrian army and support the war against terrorism.
So you gave a speech 4 days ago at the International Manifesto Group about the brutality of sanctions, and you discussed the social and health effects of sanctions. You also said that sanctions are arguably more devastating than the military war, and I agree with you. Would you like to discuss a little bit more about that here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe worth reading what I said, and also Eva Bartlett's article that came out today for RT, where she cites a number of other people on the ground, and Kevork Almasian also. Sanctions are never non-lethal measures against a target nation. Unilateral sanctions are actually illegal. So what the US tries to do is to target individuals or target an entity such as a government. And in Syria's case, the elected government, of course. But, as in Yemen also, originally, the sanctions that came in under UN Resolution 2216 were effectively against 5 targeted individuals. But of course, we know that those sanctions always develop into unilateral sanctions, coercive measures against an entire population, as they are in Yemen, as they were in Iraq. They killed 500,000 children in Iraq. And of course, Madeleine Albright famously said it's a price worth paying.
Right.
In Syria, it's no different. Sanctions kill Syrians, but they also kill hope of rebuilding, hope of restoring, hope of a future, hope of employment, hope of finding an apartment to live in. all of the effects of sanctions are they're a silent death, because people don't hear about them. People hear about bombs, people hear about war, people hear about, but they were, even under those circumstances where Syria is concerned, they don't hear about the effects of war on Syrians that actually stood against the US coalition regime change operations. Sanctions are designed to turn a people against a target government in order to achieve the objectives of the US coalition. And this, in my opinion, to deprive a people of the ability to sustain life, to deprive people of the ability to live a life of dignity. These are all violations of human rights across the board. Syria is a member of the UN. Sanctions violate the UN Charter. So the US is in violation of every single human rights convention with these sanctions, because it's preventing any kind of investment in Syria by friendly nations. It's because it's now, of course, targeting those nations if they dare to try and invest in Syria or to help the Syrians rebuild, right? So this is tantamount to genocide when you target a nation as a whole or as a part in order to wipe out those people. So we've had 10 years war. We've had 10 years of incremental sanctions that are depriving the Syrian people of their means of sustaining themselves. We have occupation of Syrian resources, because you can't look at sanctions in isolation. So you have the US occupying the oil resources, which then, of course, has a knock-on effect on industrial sectors, health sectors, fuel and energy sectors inside Syria, even agricultural sectors. Under Trump, thermal balloons were dropped onto wheat and barley crops to deliberately burn them. Wheat and barley is being stolen by various US proxies and traded outside Syria and actually restricted to the Syrian people, right? The US, as I said, is occupying oil resources. Turkey is cutting off water supply to residents in northeast Syria. The oil revenue is going to US proxies like ISIS, like the SDF, basically what is a rebranded PKK, which previously, of course, was designated a terrorist organization by the US, but now it's become a useful proxy in the Northeast, right? Al-Qaeda has set up an oil refinery monopoly. So it's processing the oil that is being stolen by the US and it's trading it to receive revenue from inside Turkey. So effectively, this entire circle of collective punishment of the Syrian people, and sanctions is only one link in that chain, but it's a very important link. It's if you like, the final humiliation and sadistic punishment of the Syrian people, who have gone through 10 years of war and emerged victorious, but now they can't rebuild, they can't recover, they can't feed themselves, they can't feed their family.
Yeah, and it extends to so many things, like how you detailed in your speech and how you just explained now. Like the sanctions affect the fuel and oil sectors, affect the industrial sector, agricultural sector, and the health sector. But yeah, like you said, that's not what's talked about in the mainstream media. They focus more on like sensationalism, and they talk about like bombs and stuff, but they don't talk about the more subliminal things like sanctions, right?
Also, what's extraordinary, they will talk about the starvation in Syria, but as they do in Yemen, it's kind of like a passive thing, right? It's like, oh, the Yemeni people are starving. No, they are being starved by the US coalition and the UN deliberately. The Syrian people are being starved. They're being killed by the US coalition and the UN in exactly the same way as they were in Iraq. But it's always presented in this kind of passive way. Or even more criminally, it's blamed on the corruption of the Syrian government.
Yeah. It's too simplistic to say that, oh, it's just because of their government. Well, you got to look further than that and see like what pressure is the government receiving, right? It's receiving pressure from sanctions, from the US. And it's the same in Syria as it is in Venezuela and all these other global South countries that are resisting Western power.
But it's also insane because I actually republished an article by an academic called Louis Alday, who you can follow on Twitter. I republished it at The Wall Will Fall, one of my platforms. And he talks about during the drought, I think it was around 2009. Anyway, it was pre-2011. And many people believe that that drought itself was orchestrated by Turkey because Turkey has control over much of the water supply, particularly to northern Syria. And he was basically saying, you know, he was working with the UN at the time, and he said, look, you have no idea to what extent the government tried to resolve the problems that arose out of the drought. And there were entire ministries that were created to deal with it, just as there were when, you know, the whole COVID crisis broke globally. The government formed specific ministries to deal with that issue. You know, the thing is, in the West, the media reduced the whole Syria argument down to one man, down to President Assad. And so what people in the West are maybe not aware of is the complexity of the government institutions here and how many people are actually government employees working in different ministries, working in NGOs and civil society, etc. You know, it's a vast apparatus. It's not one man. And different ministries deal with different issues, just as they would in the US, just as they would in the UK. You know, if we're talking democracy and if we're talking government structure, then Syria pre-2011 was progressive and reformist. And even through the war, this structure has remained intact and it has provided stability. It's not always made good decisions. Corruption in war is always going to be exacerbated, right? Across the board, across all levels of society. But corruption exists in every single country, but not every single country is under the pressures that Syria is under. And to blame the starvation and the deprivation and the unemployment and the homelessness and the hunger and the hopelessness and despair on the Syrian government that has done everything in its power. And I've witnessed to what extent it's tried to help the people and to continue providing resources despite the occupation of its resources, despite the destruction of its essential infrastructure. It has continued to provide free bread, free healthcare, electricity, although it's limited. It's still providing it. And it's still trying to find ways to counter the fuel crisis, for example. You know, it's not just abandoning its people to starvation, which is what they would like you to believe. Now that they've kind of lost the narrative on Assad is killing and gassing his own people, now they're trying to sort of paint it that he's starving his own people. But in effect, no, the West is starving these people. The West is depriving these people. The West is killing these people. Right? But as I said, it's a silent death.
Exactly.
It's an ignored death because people, I think many people don't really understand the brutality of sanctions because it's sold to them as a non-lethal measure. It's sold to them, well, you know, it's a kind of way, it's a diplomatic way of basically bringing a country to heel.
Yeah, sanctions are a war crime. That message should get out to people more. Like it's more of a war crime than like the obvious. Well, not more so. I don't not that much more so, but arguably, like how you described in your speech about how far-reaching it is. Like it's still it could be arguably more of a war crime than bombs. And Vanessa Beeley, thank you very much for coming on. People, you should follow Vanessa Beeley's work, who's on the ground in Syria reporting what's going on. Same thing with Eva Bartlett and Kevar Kalmasian. You brought up the wallwillfall.org, and I posted links just now to your speech as well as to a recent article that you put up about the elections. Where else can people find your work, Vanessa?
I'm still hanging on to Patreon. I'm on Subscribestar. Obviously, they can follow me on Twitter. I'll be publishing more, I hope, in the future at Unlimited Hangout for Whitney and at The Last American Vagabond for Ryan Christian.
Awesome. Vanessa, thank you again for coming on, and everybody else, stay informed.